I was 3 months away from breaking the promise I'd made to my dying father when a blizzard stranded the most feared food critic in America in my small town. The only place open for dinner was my struggling diner, and the only thing I could serve him was my dad's not glamorous beef stew. The exact recipe that was driving me out of business. I watched Anthony Wright take his first bite, waiting for the scathing review that would finish me off. Instead, he put down his spoon and tears started streaming down his face. Before we get into this story, I'm curious, what's your ultimate comfort food? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you love stories about family recipes, unexpected connections, and the memories we carry in every bite, please subscribe so you don't miss our next one. Now, let me take you back to the worst and best night of my life. The Blue Ridge Diner looked exactly as it had for the past 50 years. Red vinyl booths, a chrome ged counter with spinning stools, a jukebox in the corner that still played actual records, and a menu that hadn't changed since 1978. My father, Samuel Parker, had opened the place when he was 25, and he'd run it with the same stubborn consistency for 5 decades until a heart attack took him 6 months ago. I'd inherited the diner along with his dying words. "Promise me you won't change the menu, Austin. Not one dish. People need things they can count on." So, I'd promised, and I'd kept that promise, even as I watched the diner slowly die. The problem wasn't the food. It was perfectly good, honest comfort food. The problem was that perfectly good didn't cut it anymore. 20 miles away, trendy farm-to-table restaurants were serving deconstructed pot roast and artisanal meatloaf. Food bloggers were raving about molecular gastronomy and fusion cuisine. And here I was, 32 years old, serving the exact same beef stew my father had been making since before I was born. My girlfriend, ex-girlfriend now, had put it bluntly when she left 3 months ago. "Austin, you're not honoring your father's memory. You're living in it. This town is dying. This diner is dying. And you're going down with the ship because of a promise that doesn't make sense anymore." Maybe she was right. Our customer count had dropped by 60% in the last 6 months. The younger families went to other nearby cities for dinner. The tourists stopped at the new cafe on Main Street with its Instagram-worthy latte art. My regular customers were literally dying off. I'd attended 4 funerals in the past 6 months. I was running the numbers for the 3rd time that week when the blizzard hit. It came out of nowhere on a Tuesday evening in February. One of those freak storms that turns the world white in minutes. By 6 p.m. the roads were impassable. The power was flickering, and the few customers I had had were long gone, safely home before conditions got dangerous. I should have closed early. I should have locked up and headed to my apartment above the diner. But something stubbornness maybe, or the habits of a lifetime spent in this place, made me stay open until our posted closing time of 9 p.m. At 8:47, the door opened, bringing with it a blast of snow and cold air. The man who entered was tall, probably in his mid-50s, wearing an expensive wool coat, now dusted with snow. He had sharp features, silver hair, and the kind of presence that made you pay attention, even covered in snow, and clearly exhausted from fighting the storm. He carried himself with an authority that seemed out of place in this small town. "Thank God," he said, his voice cultured with the faintest trace of a New York accent. "I've been driving for 20 minutes looking for any sign of civilization. Are you still serving food?" "Yes, sir," I said. Because that's what you say in a small town, even when you're minutes from closing and facing the end of everything you've known. "Have a seat anywhere. Can I get you some coffee to warm up?" "Please." He chose a booth by the window, though there was nothing to see but swirling white. As he removed his coat and settled in, I got a better look at him. Something about his face was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I brought him coffee and a menu, watching as he glanced at it with an expression I'd seen 1,000 times, polite disappointment at the limited, old-fashioned options. "What do you recommend?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made me defensive. "The beef stew is our specialty. It's been on the menu since we opened. Comes with homemade biscuits and a side salad." "I'll have that then." He handed back the menu and pulled out his phone, frowning at the screen. "No signal, of course. The storm's knocked out the cell tower. Happens sometimes. It'll be back by morning." I retreated to the kitchen, grateful that I'd made a fresh batch of stew that afternoon. My father's recipe was simple: beef chuck, potatoes, carrots, onions, celery, beef stock, tomato paste, and a blend of herbs that he'd never written down. I'd learned it by watching him by standing at his elbow for thousands of dinner services, absorbing the proportions and techniques that he claimed made all the difference. It's not fancy, he used to say, but it's honest. Every ingredient matters, and you never rush it. Good stew is like good friendship. It takes time to develop the flavor. As I ladled the stew into a bowl and plated 2 of the biscuits I'd made fresh that morning, I felt the familiar weight of inadequacy. This was comfort food, diner food, nothing special. It was the kind of meal that made people feel at home, but it wasn't going to save my business or make anyone think I was anything more than a small-town guy serving his dead father's recipes. I brought the meal to the stranger along with butter for the biscuits and a glass of water. He nodded his thanks and picked up his spoon. And that's when it hit me. I knew exactly who he was. Anthony Wright, the most feared food critic in America, the man who'd shut down a 3-Michelin-star restaurant in Manhattan with a single devastating review. The writers whose columns in Culinary Quarterly could make or break a restaurant's reputation overnight. And I just served him my father's pedestrian beef stew in a dying diner in the middle of nowhere. My heart started pounding. I considered saying something, maybe apologizing in advance for the simplicity of the meal, but what would I say? Sorry, this isn't up to your usual standards, but it's all we've got. That would just make it worse. Instead, I retreated behind the counter, pretending to clean the coffee machine while watching him out of the corner of my eye. Wright lifted a spoonful of stew to his lips, inhaled the aroma briefly, and took a bite. Then he went completely still. His spoon clattered back to the bowl. He stared down at the food like it had just spoken to him. And then, to my absolute shock, tears began streaming down his face. Not a single tear, not a subtle welling up. Actual tears flowing freely down the cheeks of a man known for his brutal, emotionless critiques of the world's finest restaurants. I stood frozen behind the counter, having no idea what to do. Had I somehow poisoned him? Was he having an allergic reaction? Should I call for help? And if so, how? With no cell service and the landline only reaching the volunteer fire department, Wright pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his eyes, but the tears kept coming. He took another bite of stew and his shoulders started shaking. I couldn't stand it anymore. I walked over to his booth. "Sir, are you okay? Is something wrong with the food?" He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Where did you get this recipe?" The question wasn't what I had expected. It's my father's recipe. He made it the same way for 50 years. Why? Every ingredient. I need to know every ingredient, every technique, every single detail of how this was prepared. I sat down across from him completely confused. It's just a beef stew. Chuck roast, vegetables, stock, tomato paste, herbs. We braise it low and slow for about 4 hours. Nothing fancy. The herbs, he said urgently. What herbs exactly? Thyme, bay leaves, and I paused because this was the part my father had always been mysterious about. And something else. My dad called it his secret ingredient, but he never told me what it was. I finally figured it out by smell. It's marjoram, just a tiny amount added in the last 30 minutes of cooking. Wright put his head in his hands. Marjoram. Of course, I should have known. I should have remembered. "Mr. Wright," I said, because there was no point pretending I didn't know who he was. "I don't understand what's happening. Did I do something wrong?" He looked up at me and his expression was a mixture of grief, wonder, and something like joy. "You know who I am. Everyone in the restaurant business knows who you are, sir. Then you should know that I've eaten at every restaurant worth mentioning in North America and probably half of Europe. I've had meals prepared by world-renowned chefs, dishes that cost more than most people make in a week. I've tasted innovation, artistry, and culinary genius at the highest level." He gestured to the bowl of stew in front of him. "And this simple beef stew in a diner is the most important meal I've had in 20 years because it tastes exactly, impossibly perfectly like my mother's recipe. A recipe I thought I'd lost forever when she died." The kitchen felt too warm suddenly. I loosened my collar. That's not possible. My father created this recipe." "Did he?" Wright asked gently. "Or did someone teach it to him?" I sat back, my mind racing. My father opened the diner in 1978 when he was 25. He'd always said he'd learned to cook from the best teacher he ever had, but he'd never elaborated. I assumed he meant his own mother, my grandmother, but she'd always insisted she'd never taught him anything beyond how to boil water. "My mother's name was Catherine Wright," Anthony continued. "Before she married my father and moved to New York, She lived near here. She worked in restaurants, saved every penny, dreamed of opening her own place someday. She had a gift for cooking, not fancy food, but the kind that made you feel loved. Her beef stew was legendary among the people who knew her. He took another bite, closing his eyes as he tasted it. She died 20 years ago. Suddenly, an aneurysm. She was gone before any one of us could say goodbye, and her recipes died with her. She never wrote anything down, said cooking was about feeling and instinct, not measurements. I tried for years to recreate her stew, but I could never get it right. The closest I came was missing something, some element I couldn't identify. The margarm, I said quietly. The margarm, he confirmed. She called it her secret whisper, just enough to add complexity without being identifiable. I'd forgotten. I'd tasted it thousands of times, but never knew what it was. But how would my father have known her recipe? Wright pulled out his wallet and extracted an old, worn photograph. He handed it to me. I keep this photo of her in my wallet because it shows how happy she was in a kitchen since her youth. The picture showed a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, standing in a kitchen I recognized immediately. The Blue Ridge Diner's kitchen, looking newer, but unmistakably the same. She was laughing, wearing an apron, holding a wooden spoon. Next to her, with his arm around her shoulders, was a young man I also recognized from old photographs. My father, decades before I was born. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in fading ink, was written, Catherine and Sam, 1979. Best kitchen partner I ever had. I promise to never change your stew. Farewell, Cat. SP. The world seemed to tilt. That's my father. They worked together. She must have, Wright said, his voice soft with wonder. Before she moved to New York, before she met my father. She must have worked here, taught your father her recipes, made him promise to preserve them. I thought about my father's dying words, about his insistence that I never change the menu. I'd thought it was about tradition, about stubborn consistency. But it wasn't about that at all. It was about keeping a promise to a friend, about preserving something precious that had been entrusted to him. Mr. Wright, I said, my own voice getting thick now. My father made me promise the same thing. On his deathbed, he made me swear I wouldn't change the menu. I've been keeping that promise even though it's killing this business. I thought I was being loyal to him, but really I was being loyal to your mother's recipes. We sat there in silence for a moment. Two men connected by a woman's food, by a recipe that had survived decades and traveled through generations. May I see your kitchen? Wright asked finally. I'd like to understand how this miracle survived. I led him through the swinging door into the Blue Ridge's small, efficient kitchen. Everything was old but meticulously maintained. The six-burner stove my father had bought used in 1982. The ancient refrigerator that still ran perfectly. The wooden cutting boards worn smooth by decades of use. Wright moved through the space like he was touring a cathedral. He ran his hands over the counters, examined the pots hanging from their hooks, studied the spice rack with its labeled jars. This is exactly the kind of kitchen she loved, he said. Simple, honest, built for doing good work rather than showing off. She used to say that fancy equipment was just a way of covering up for lack of skill. Mr. Wright, can I ask you something? Call me Anthony. I think we're past formalities. Anthony, then why did you become a food critic? If you loved your mother's cooking so much, why spend your life judging other people's food so harshly? He was quiet for a long moment, still looking around the kitchen. Honestly, I was looking for her. In every restaurant, every meal, every dish I reviewed, part of me was searching for that feeling of home, that sense of being loved that her cooking gave me. When I couldn't find it, and I never did, not once in 20 years, I got angry, bitter. I took out my disappointment on chefs who were just trying to make people happy the way my mother had. That's why your reviews are so harsh, I said, understanding dawning. You weren't judging the food. You were mourning what you'd lost. Perhaps, though, that's not much of an excuse for the damage I've done to good people's livelihoods. He turned to face me. Austin, may I ask you something now? Of course. What are you going to do with this place? Your father's been gone 6 months. You must have thought about your own future. The question I'd been avoiding for months. I don't know. I promised him I wouldn't change anything, but the diner's dying. We're losing money every month. In 3 months, maybe 4, I'll have to close the doors permanently. Because you're serving your father's food, your father's way to a world that's moved on, Anthony said. But what if the world hasn't moved on? What if it just forgot what really matters? I don't understand. He gestured around the kitchen. This place, This food, these recipes, they're not old-fashioned or outdated. They're authentic. They're real. In a world of foam and tweezers and ingredients that no one can pronounce, you're offering something that's become rare. Honest comfort, made with skill and preserved with love. That's not worthless. That's priceless. Then why is no one coming here? I asked, the frustration of 6 months finally breaking through. Why am I serving 20 meals a day when I used to serve 100? Because no one knows what you have, Anthony said simply. You're the best kept secret, and secrets don't keep restaurants open. You need to tell your story, and I think I know how to do that. The storm continued through the night. Anthony called his assistant on the diner's landline to explain he'd be delayed, then helped himself to more stew and biscuits while we talked. He told me about his mother, not Catherine Wright the cook, but Catherine the person, how she'd sing while she chopped vegetables, how she'd believed that feeding people was a way of loving them, how she died with dreams unfulfilled, never having opened her own restaurant, but having touched countless lives through her cooking. I told him about my father, about his stubborn integrity, his pride in doing things right, his belief that consistency was a virtue, about how he'd worked 7 days a week for 50 years, how he'd fed generations of the town families, how he died in the kitchen doing what he loved. They sound like they understood each other. Anthony said, your father and my mother, both of them believers in the power of simple, honest food to create community. He kept her recipe alive for 45 years, and I've been keeping it alive for him, but I don't know if that's enough anymore. Then let's make sure it is, Anthony said. 3 days later, after the roads were cleared and Anthony had returned to New York, I got a call from him. I've written something. It's not my usual kind of review. In fact, it's not a review at all. It's a story about food and memory and the connections that survive us. I'm sending it to you before I publish it. If you're not comfortable with anything, I'll change it. The email arrived moments later. I opened the attached document and started reading. The Stew That Stopped Time, a personal essay by Anthony Wright. It wasn't a critique. It wasn't a rating or a technical analysis. It was a love letter to his mother, to my father, to the Blue Ridge Diner, and to the power of food to carry memories across decades. He wrote about the blizzard, about finding the diner, about that first bite of stew that had transported him back to his childhood. He wrote about learning the impossible truth that his mother's recipe had survived, preserved by a man who'd promised to never change it, and carried forward by a son honoring his father's wishes. He wrote about authenticity in an age of artifice, about the difference between cooking that impresses and cooking that comforts, about how the most important ingredient in any dish isn't something you can buy or measure. It's the love and care that goes into its preparation. And he wrote about the Blue Ridge Diner as a place that mattered, a place worth preserving, a place where anyone could find what he'd found. A taste of home, a connection to the past, and proof that some things are worth keeping exactly as they are. I called him immediately. Anthony, I can't let you publish this. It's too personal, and the attention is exactly what you need. He finished. Austin, this essay is the most honest thing I've written in my entire career. For 20 years, I've been a critic, tearing down other people's work while searching for something I didn't even know I could find. You and your father gave me back a piece of my mother. Let me give you something in return. What if people come and they're disappointed? What if the food isn't good enough? The food is perfect, Anthony said firmly. It's been perfect for 45 years. Trust me. Trust your father. Trust Catherine. They knew what they were doing. The essay published in Culinary Quarterly 3 days later and went viral within hours. By the end of the first day, my phone, the diner's landline, since I still didn't have a website or any real internet presence, was ringing constantly with people asking about our hours, our menu, how to find us. By the end of the first week, we had reservations booked out for 3 months. By the end of the first month, I'd had to hire back the 2 servers I'd let go and bring in a part-time cook to help me keep up with demand. People came from all over New England to taste the stew that made Anthony Wright cry. They took pictures of the diner, of the menu, of their meals. They wrote their own blog posts and social media updates about finding this hidden gem. But more than that, they came for what Anthony had described: authenticity, connection, the feeling of being in a place that valued tradition and quality over trends and profit margins. The Blue Ridge Diner was saved. And in the process, I discovered why my father had made me promise to never change the menu. It wasn't about the food being perfect, though it was. It wasn't about stubbornly clinging to the past, though it might have seemed that way. It was about understanding that some things have value precisely because they don't change, because they remain constant in an inconstant world. My father had kept Catherine Wright's recipes alive, not because he was stuck in the past, but because he understood they were worth preserving. And by making me promise to do the same, he'd ensured that her legacy and his would continue. 6 months after the essay published, Anthony returned to the town. This time he wasn't stranded by a blizzard. He came intentionally, driving up from New York on a beautiful September afternoon. He wanted to see it, he said, looking around the now bustling diner. He wanted to see what happened. Every booth was full. Every stool at the counter was occupied. And in the corner, there was a new addition. A framed photograph of a young woman in a kitchen smiling as she held a wooden spoon, and a young man with his arms around her shoulders, smiling as well. Anthony stood in front of the photograph for a long time, not speaking. When he finally turned back to me, his eyes were wet again. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping her alive, for honoring what my mother and your father built together." "Thank you," I replied, "for helping me understand why it mattered, for showing me that keeping a promise isn't the same as living in the past." We had dinner together that night after closing, beef stew, of course, and biscuits and conversation that lasted until midnight. We talked about our parents, about the legacies they'd left us, about the unexpected ways that love and memory endure. "I've decided something," Anthony told me as he prepared to leave. "I'm retiring from restaurant criticism. That essay I wrote about this place, that's the last one. I'm done judging other people's passion. I want to do something different." "What will you do?" "I'm writing a cookbook about my mother, about her approach to cooking, about how food connects us to the people we love. And I was hoping you might help me. Your father preserved her recipes. Maybe together we can share them with the world." 6 months later, Catherine's Kitchen, Recipes for Connection, was published. It featured Catherine Wright's recipes prepared and photographed at the Blue Ridge Diner with stories from both Anthony and me about the parents who'd shaped us. The book became a bestseller, but more importantly, it helped people understand what my father had always known, that the best food doesn't have to be complicated or innovative. It just has to be made with care, served with love, and shared with people who matter. The Blue Ridge Diner is thriving now. We serve the same menu we've always served, made the same way it's always been made. People come from all over to taste Catherine Wright's recipes, preserved by my father and carried forward by me. And every time I ladle out a bowl of beef stew, every time I add that secret whisper of marjoram in the final 30 minutes, I think about the promise my father made to Catherine 45 years ago and the promise I made to him. Some promises are worth keeping, even when, especially when they seem to hold you back, because they're not really about the past. They're about carrying forward what matters, about honoring the people who shaped us, about preserving the connections that make us human. My father's not gourmet beef stew saved my diner. But more than that, it connected me to people I'd never met, taught me lessons I didn't know I needed, and showed me that the most important ingredient in any recipe isn't something you can buy or measure. It's the love that survives us, preserved in every carefully followed instruction, every secret ingredient, every promise kept. What did you think of the way Anthony dealt with grief through his search for his mother's recipe, and how he transformed that pain into preserving her legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story about family recipes, unexpected connections, and the power of keeping promises touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming stories every day. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss our next uplifting tale. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next.